Thank you for listening to our audiobook channel. Please like, share and subscribe if you haven't already to be notified of new uploads every single week. And now for the feature presentation, Murder Among the Ruins, a Tony and Sally mystery. Chapter 1, A Roman Holiday. The train rattled into Termini station, a sharp whistle announcing its arrival in Rome. The sun hung high over the eternal city, casting golden light on domes and spires as two young travellers stepped onto the bustling platform, their eyes alight with excitement. Tony Middleton adjusted his hat and stretched his arms. "Ah, Rome! I feel like Caesar returning from battle." Sally Cartwright laughed, tightening the ribbon on her bonnet. "More like a schoolboy arriving for an excursion. Try not to get into trouble within the first hour, Tony." They were best friends, both students at Bramley College, London, and avid lovers of history and adventure. Rome had been their chosen destination for a well-earned holiday. They had spent weeks poring over guidebooks, planning their visits to the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the Vatican. Now, at last they had arrived, eager to explore the city that had stood for centuries. After collecting their luggage, they hailed a carriage and rode through the cobbled streets. Rome was a dazzling blend of old and new, vibrant markets brimming with chatter, ivy-clad ruins standing proudly among bustling coffee shops, and grand fountains glistening under the afternoon sun. Their hotel, Villa Luciana, was a charming establishment near the Piazza Venezia. The building had a faded elegance, its marble floors cool beneath their feet as they checked in. A stern-faced concierge handed them a heavy brass key, muttering in thickly accented English. "Your room is on the second floor, breakfast is served at 7, and please do not disturb the other guests." Tony exchanged a glance with Sally. "I feel like we've walked into a Gothic novel," he murmured as they climbed the staircase. The room itself was pleasant, with high ceilings, antique furnishings, and a small balcony overlooking a quiet street. Sally unpacked methodically while Tony flung open the shutters, inhaling the Roman air. "Come on, let's not waste a minute," he said. "The Colosseum awaits." Their first stop was the Colosseum, the mighty amphitheatre that had once hosted battles between gladiators and wild beasts. The ruins were immense, their stone walls weathered by time, yet still standing as a testament to Rome's former glory. "Imagine the spectacles that took place here," Sally said in awe. "Tens of thousands watching, the roar of the crowd, the clash of swords." They wandered through the arches, marvelling at the underground chambers where fighters had once prepared for battle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the air was thick with the whispers of history. It was there, among the ruins, that they met a peculiar group of fellow tourists. There was Professor Alistair Kent, a wiry, bespectacled historian who spoke in rapid bursts of enthusiasm, his hands forever gesturing. He seemed particularly obsessed with ancient manuscripts and Roman artifacts. Then there was Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore, a wealthy widow in a dark green travelling dress. She carried a parasol and spoke with the slow precision of someone who measured her words carefully. The third member of the group was Mr. Julian Forsyth, a young man in his late 20s, well-dressed but pale and reserved. He had the air of someone who preferred solitude but had been unwillingly dragged into company. Lastly, there was Sir Reginald Ainsley, a stout British diplomat with a booming voice and an unmistakable air of self-importance. He was the kind of man who would argue with a local guide simply because he could. As the group meandered through the ruins, Sir Reginald was boasting about his travels. "I tell you, nothing compares to the grand architecture of the British Empire," he declared. "The Romans had their time, but we have surpassed them in every way." Professor Kent adjusted his spectacles. "Ah, but Rome was the foundation of Western civilization, Sir Reginald. Without their advances in engineering, law and governance, we wouldn't have the world we do today." "Rubbish," Sir Reginald scoffed. Tony leaned over to Sally. "This might turn into a duel," he whispered. Sally smirked, but suddenly noticed Julian Forsyth standing apart from the group, staring at something in the distance. She followed his gaze and saw a hooded figure lingering near one of the crumbling arches, watching them. A shiver ran down her spine. "Tony, look!" Tony followed her glance, but just as he did, the figure turned and vanished into the shadows. "Who was that?" Sally asked. "Perhaps just another tourist," Tony said, though he didn't sound convinced. As the tour concluded, the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. They said their goodbyes to the group, each heading back to their respective lodgings. "I must admit," Tony said as they walked back to Villa Luciana, "I didn't expect to meet such an interesting crowd on our first day." "Nor did I," Sally murmured, "and I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched." Chapter 2. A Shocking Discovery. The morning air in Rome carried the scent of fresh bread, roasted coffee, and the faint traces of damp stone from a light rain that had fallen during the night. The city was waking up, vendors setting up their stalls, carriages clattering over the cobbled streets, and church bells ringing from distant towers. Tony Middleton and Sally Cartwright stepped out of Villa Luciana, eager to begin another day of exploration. "The Roman Forum today," Tony said. "Just imagine, Julius Caesar himself once walked those very stones." "And was promptly stabbed on them," Sally replied wryly. "Let's hope history doesn't repeat itself." Their plan was to meet with Professor Kent, Mrs. Whitmore, Julian Forsyth, and Sir Reginald Ainsley, whom they had met at the Colosseum the day before. The group had agreed to tour the Forum together, each bringing their own perspective, Professor Kent with his historical knowledge, Sir Reginald with his pompous opinions, and Mrs. Whitmore with her quiet yet astute observations. Julian Forsyth had remained an enigma to Sally. There was something withdrawn about him, a shadow of preoccupation in his eyes. And then there was the mysterious hooded figure they had spotted at the Colosseum. The memory lingered in the back of her mind. The Roman Forum was a grand sprawl of ruins, once the heart of political, religious, and commercial life in ancient Rome. Broken columns, fallen temples, and crumbling archways stood like forgotten sentinels of a bygone era. Tourists wandered about, some listening to guides, others simply taking in the scene in quiet awe. Professor Kent was already at the entrance, adjusting his glasses with the eager energy of a man in his element. "Ah, Tony, Sally, you're just in time. The others are waiting near the Temple of Saturn." As they strolled through the ruins, the professor animatedly explained the history of each site. "This temple," he said, pointing to the towering remains of the Temple of Castor and Pollux, was dedicated to the twin sons of Zeus, built in 495 BC, after they supposedly appeared on the battlefield to secure a Roman victory. Marvellous, isn't it? Sir Reginald Ainsley stood nearby, frowning. "I dare say these Romans spent an awful lot of time worshipping the wrong gods." Tony chuckled under his breath, but Sally's attention was elsewhere. Mrs. Whitmore and Julian Forsyth were missing. "I thought we were all meeting here," she murmured. Professor Kent seemed unconcerned. "Oh, Mrs. Whitmore and Julian arrived before me. They went ahead towards the Temple of Vesta." "That's odd," Sally said. "I didn't think they were particularly friendly with one another." Tony shrugged. "Maybe they share a passion for architecture." A moment later, a young Italian guide came rushing towards them, his face pale. He spoke in hurried Italian to Professor Kent, who stiffened. "What is it?" Tony asked. Kent turned to them, his expression grave. "There's been an incident." Following the guide, the group hurried through the ruins, their footsteps crunching against the gravel path. They reached the Temple of Vesta, where a small crowd had gathered near the steps of the ruined sanctuary. In the centre of the commotion, a figure lay sprawled on the ground, deathly still. It was Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore. Sally gasped. The once imposing widow, always so composed, now lay motionless, her fine travelling clothes stained with dirt. Her parasol lay beside her, snapped in half. Her face was frozen in an expression of surprise, or perhaps fear. A uniformed officer stood over her, speaking to another man who wore a dark suit and a frown of authority. A small group of onlookers whispered among themselves. Tony swallowed hard. Good Lord! Professor Kent removed his hat and muttered, "This is terrible." Sir Reginald Ainsley, arriving behind them, took one look at the scene and turned pale. "Dear me, this is most inconvenient." Sally shot him a glare. "Inconvenient?" "I mean tragic, of course," he corrected hastily, adjusting his cravat. The officer in the dark suit turned to them. He was a lean man, with sharp features and piercing dark eyes that missed nothing. "I am Inspector DeLuca," he announced in flawless English. "And you are?" Tony hesitated. "We knew the victim. We were supposed to meet her here." DeLuca studied them for a moment, then nodded. "Then I will need to ask you some questions." The group was led to a quieter section of the ruins, away from the growing crowd. The inspector's manner was cool but methodical. "What do you know of the deceased?" he asked. "She was Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore," Professor Kent said. "A widow, quite wealthy, I believe." "And what was she doing here?" "She wanted to see the Forum," Tony answered. "We all did." The inspector tapped his fingers against his chin. "Did she have enemies? Was anyone quarrelling with her?" There was a brief silence. Then Sir Reginald cleared his throat. "She and I had a small disagreement yesterday, but it was nothing of consequence." "What about Julian Forsyth?" Sally interjected. "He was supposed to be with her." DeLuca's expression darkened. "Mr. Forsyth is missing." Tony and Sally exchanged glances. "That's very strange," Tony murmured. "Indeed," the inspector said. "We found her body at the foot of the Temple of Vesta. There are no signs of a struggle. But," he pointed to her hand, "there is something curious." Mrs. Whitmore's right hand was curled into a fist. Carefully, DeLuca pried it open, revealing a small object, a golden Roman coin. Sally leaned closer. "That looks ancient." DeLuca nodded. "A genuine aureus, worth a great deal." Tony frowned. Why was she holding it? "That," the inspector said, "is what I intend to find out." The day that had begun with excitement had turned grim. A woman was dead, a man was missing, and a mystery was unfolding among the ruins of ancient Rome. As Tony and Sally left the Forum, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something much bigger than they had anticipated. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. The streets of Rome felt different in the wake of Mrs. Whitmore's murder. What had once been an enchanting labyrinth of history and wonder was now cast in the shadow of something sinister. Tony and Sally walked briskly along the Via del Corso, their minds heavy with unanswered questions. "I can't believe she's dead," Sally murmured. "She was standing right in front of us yesterday, full of life. And now—" Tony exhaled sharply. "Murdered, and Julian Forsyth is missing. That can't be a coincidence." They had spent the last hour answering Inspector DeLuca's questions. The Italian detective had an air of quiet calculation, his mind working behind those keen dark eyes. But while he seemed competent, Tony and Sally knew from past experience that sometimes a fresh perspective, their perspective, was what a case needed. And this was no ordinary crime. Mrs. Whitmore's body had been found clutching an ancient Roman aureus, a coin of great historical and monetary value. Had she been involved in some secret dealings? Or had she simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? One thing was certain, Julian Forsyth had vanished, and they needed to find him. Their first stop was Hotel Vittoria, where Julian had been staying. The grand establishment, located near the Spanish Steps, was far more luxurious than Villa Luciana. Its lobby was adorned with gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers, and a sharp-looking concierge stood behind a mahogany desk. Sally approached him. "Excuse me, we're looking for Mr. Julian Forsyth. He's a guest here." The concierge, an older Italian gentleman with slicked-back hair, frowned. "Signor Forsyth? I am afraid he has not returned since yesterday." Tony's eyebrows shot up. "Not at all?" The concierge shook his head. "His room remains untouched. His key is still here." He gestured to a polished wooden key rack behind him, where a brass tag with room 207 dangled. Sally exchanged a glance with Tony. "Did he say where he was going?" "No, signorina, but he received a message before he left. A note." Tony leaned in. "Who sent it?" The concierge hesitated, then shrugged. "I do not know. A boy delivered it. I did not read it." Tony and Sally left the hotel with even more questions. "This is bad," Tony said. "If Julian didn't return, then either he's hiding or—" "Someone doesn't want him to return," Sally finished. They had to find that note. Their next lead came unexpectedly. As they passed through a narrow alley near the Pantheon, Sally spotted a small shop with an ornate wooden sign, "Giorgio Malfini, Antiquities and Rare Coins." Her pulse quickened. "Tony, the coin! Maybe this place has answers." The shop smelled of parchment and aged metal. Inside, cabinets held ancient scrolls, marble busts, and glass cases filled with Roman coins. Behind the counter stood a thin man in his 60s, his face weathered like an old manuscript. "Buongiorno," he greeted them with a courteous nod. Sally wasted no time. "Signor Malfini, we need information about an aureus coin." Malfini's eyes twinkled. "Ah, a fine choice. Roman aurei are rare treasures." Tony took out a rough sketch he had made of the coin, based on what they had seen in Mrs. Whitmore's hand. "Does this look familiar?" Malfini adjusted his glasses and studied it. His expression darkened. This is no ordinary coin." "What do you mean?" Sally said. "This particular design is from the reign of Emperor Claudius. But see here." He pointed to the uneven edges Tony had drawn. "This suggests it was not circulated as currency." Tony frowned. "Then what was it?" Malfini lowered his voice. "A temple offering." Sally's breath caught. "A relic?" The antiquarian nodded. "Such coins were placed in secret vaults beneath ancient temples, gifts to the gods. If one has resurfaced, it means someone has been digging where they should not." Tony and Sally exchanged glances. Mrs. Whitmore had been murdered while clutching a stolen temple relic. Had she been involved in smuggling, or had she simply stumbled upon something she shouldn't have? And if so, was that why Julian Forsyth had disappeared? Just as they were leaving the shop, an unexpected voice called out from the doorway. "Looking for me?" They spun around. Julian Forsyth stood there, his face pale, his clothes rumpled, his hands were trembling. "Julian!" Sally exclaimed. "Where have you been?" The young man stepped inside, casting nervous glances over his shoulder. I was hiding," he admitted. "They're after me." Tony's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Julian's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't know, but they killed Mrs. Whitmore, and I think I'm next." Sally's stomach tightened. "Tell us everything." Julian hesitated, then sighed. "I met Mrs. Whitmore by chance at the Forum yesterday morning. She was acting strange. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she were being followed." "Did she say why?" Tony asked. Julian nodded. "She told me she had something valuable, something that could change history. She wanted to keep it safe." Sally blew a low whistle. "The coin?" "Yes," Julian whispered. "She said it was part of something much bigger. And then He swallowed hard. Then someone sent me a note. It told me to meet Mrs. Whitmore at the Temple of Vesta. But when I got there, she was already dead. Tony clenched his jaw. And you ran? I panicked, Julian admitted. I knew I'd be blamed. Sally took a deep breath. Julian, we need to go to Inspector DeLuca. Julian hesitated. No, he said, not yet. Why? Tony demanded. Julian looked at them with desperate eyes. Because I know where the rest of the treasure is. Silence fell between them. Then Sally spoke. Where? Julian exhaled. Beneath the ruins of an old church, Santa Lucia della Croce. Tony and Sally had heard of it. A forgotten church on the outskirts of Rome, abandoned for centuries. Tony smirked. Well, that sounds like the perfect place for a murder mystery. Sally shot him a look. Tony, this isn't a game. Julian's voice trembled. It will be if we don't get there before they do. Sally nodded grimly. Chapter 4. The Suspects Speak. Tony Middleton, Sally Cartwright and Julian Forsyth walked briskly away from Giorgio Malfini's antiquities shop, keeping to narrow alleyways. Julian was still visibly shaken, glancing nervously over his shoulder every few steps. I can't go back to my hotel, he said in a hushed voice. They know where I was staying. If they find me... Tony gave him a reassuring clap on the back. We won't let that happen. Sally was more pragmatic. We need to speak to Inspector DeLuca. You may be afraid, Julian, but this is bigger than just you. Mrs. Whitmore is dead, and we don't know who might be next. Julian swallowed hard but nodded. Fine, but we should be careful about what we tell him. As they made their way toward the police headquarters near Piazza Venezia, the city bustled around them, vendors calling out in Italian, carriages rattling over the stones, groups of tourists marvelling at ruins they had seen in history books. It felt strange, almost surreal, that a murder investigation was unfolding in the midst of such normality. When they arrived, the inspector was seated at his desk, flipping through a file of papers. His dark eyes lifted as they entered, and he gestured for them to sit. I was hoping you would return, he said, his voice calm but expectant. Especially you, Signor Forsyth. Julian stiffened, but sat down, gripping his hat in his lap. I didn't kill Mrs. Whitmore, he said immediately. DeLuca leaned back. Then tell me where you have been. Julian took a deep breath and recounted everything. His meeting with Mrs. Whitmore at the Forum, her nervous behaviour, the mysterious note instructing him to meet her at the Temple of Vesta, and his discovery of her body. He left out the part about the hidden treasure beneath Santa Lucia della Croce. When he finished, DeLuca studied him for a long moment. Then he slid a small folded paper across the desk. Is this the note you received? Julian's eyes widened. He picked it up with trembling fingers. Meet me at the Temple of Vesta. I must speak with you before it's too late. B.W. It's the same one, Julian said. Where did you find it? DeLuca's expression darkened. Inside Mrs. Whitmore's travel bag, tucked into her journal. The ink was still fresh, meaning she wrote it only hours before her death. Sally's brow furrowed. That means she was the one who wanted to meet Julian, not the other way around. Tony leaned forward. Inspector, what do we know about Mrs. Whitmore? Did she have enemies? The inspector sighed. We have learned a few things. She was a wealthy widow, as you know. Her late husband was an industrialist who made his fortune in textiles. But, he paused meaningfully, she was also a collector of rare artifacts, and not always legally. Sally inhaled sharply. Are you saying she was a smuggler? Possibly, he admitted. Some of her letters suggest she was involved in acquiring relics that should have remained in museum collections. And this coin she had, the aureus, it was part of some greater treasure, Tony said. The inspector hesitated. That is what we must determine, but she was not the only one with an interest in such things. He pulled out another document and set it before them. I have spoken with the rest of your travel companions. Their alibis are questionable. DeLuca flipped through his notes and read aloud, Sir Reginald Ainsley. He claims he was in his hotel room writing letters at the time of the murder, but when questioned further, he admitted to leaving for a brief walk, alone. Tony rolled his eyes. Sir Reginald always struck me as pompous, but do you really think he's capable of murder? Sally looked thoughtful. If Mrs. Whitmore was involved in illegal artifact trading, and if Sir Reginald found out, he might have wanted to put an end to it. He's the kind of man who values reputation. DeLuca moved on. Professor Alistair Kent. The professor says he was at the Basilica of Saint Clement, studying inscriptions. But he was seen returning to his hotel much later than he originally claimed. Sally tapped her chin. He was particularly interested in the history of the Forum. If there was something valuable buried there, he would certainly want to know about it. Tony frowned. Or maybe he had a falling out with Mrs. Whitmore over a deal gone wrong. DeLuca made a small note and continued. Julian Forsyth. Aside from running away, his alibi remains uncertain. Julian groaned. I already told you, I was scared. The inspector raised an eyebrow. Running only makes you look guiltier, Signor Forsyth. Then, finally, the last name. Giorgio Malfini. The antiquities dealer. He told me he had never seen the Aureus before, but a witness claims to have seen him speaking with Mrs. Whitmore 2 days ago, heatedly. Sally's eyes widened. That's a direct connection. Tony nodded. If Mrs. Whitmore was trying to sell stolen artifacts, she may have crossed the wrong buyer. DeLuca folded his hands. We have suspects, motives, and a stolen treasure that may still be hidden somewhere beneath the city, but we do not yet have a killer. Sally leaned forward. Inspector, we think we know where the rest of the treasure might be. Julian stiffened. Sally? Tony nodded. Beneath the ruins of Santa Lucia della Croce. Mrs. Whitmore told Julian she had something valuable. If she found the Aureus, there might be more. DeLuca's eyes narrowed. And you wish to go there? We don't just wish to, Tony said. We need to. The inspector studied them carefully, then sighed. Very well, but I insist on accompanying you. Julian exhaled in relief. Thank you. DeLuca stood. We will go at dusk. As they left the police headquarters, the weight of the night ahead pressed down on them. A murder had been committed. The suspects were all hiding secrets, and somewhere beneath the ancient city, buried in the dark, lay the truth. Chapter 5. A Clue in the Ruins. By the time Tony, Sally and Julian and the inspector approached the outskirts of the city, the sun had vanished behind a ridge of hills, leaving only streaks of crimson and a gathering blue twilight. The road they followed narrowed into a worn stone path, bordered on either side by cypress trees. It was eerily quiet. Before them stood the decaying facade of Santa Lucia della Croce, a forgotten church with a crooked steeple and boarded windows. Vines crawled over its crumbling stone walls, and the once grand wooden doors were sagging on rusted hinges. Sally pulled her coat tighter around her. I can't believe this place hasn't collapsed entirely. Tony grinned. Perfect setting for a ghost story or a murder mystery. Let's hope it doesn't become both, Sally muttered. DeLuca stepped ahead, lantern in hand. The flickering flame cast long dancing shadows on the walls as he pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the church was steeped in silence. Dust hung thick in the air. Broken pews were scattered across the nave, and the altar stood in sad disrepair, its once polished marble now dull and cracked. Julian hesitated in the doorway, then pointed. She said it was beneath the altar. There's a trap door of some kind, hidden. DeLuca stepped forward and examined the base of the altar with practiced precision. He knelt, running his fingers along the seams in the floor. A moment later, there was a sharp click. A square section of stone lifted slightly. Tony bent down and helped pry it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into pitch blackness. "Ladies first," he offered. Sally rolled her eyes and grabbed the second lantern. "Try not to fall on me, Middleton." One by one, they descended into the darkness. The stairway opened into a subterranean chamber, low-ceilinged, circular, and lined with alcoves. The walls were carved with Latin inscriptions, and crumbling stone sarcophagi lined the perimeter. "This must have been the catacombs," DeLuca murmured. "Early Christian burial chambers." Sally's light swept across a faded mosaic of a dove above an archway. "Look," she said, pointing, "that inscription, Veritas te liberabit." "The truth shall set you free," Julian translated softly. Tony moved toward the center of the chamber. In the dust-covered floor, he spotted something out of place, a thin metal disc embedded in the ground, surrounded by a faded circle of red tiles. He knelt and brushed away the dust. It was a hidden compartment, sealed with an iron latch. Tony pried it open. Inside was a small chest, wooden, reinforced with brass. He lifted it carefully. They all crowded around as he opened the lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were several gleaming Roman aurae, just like the one found in Mrs. Whitmore's hand, along with delicate gold bracelets, small statues, and a scroll tied with a ribbon, so aged it crumbled at the touch. Julian let out a low whistle. "It's real! She was telling the truth!" Sally stared in awe. A treasure hoard, hidden for centuries! DeLuca was less impressed by the gleam, and the motive for murder becomes clearer. Tony was about to speak when something caught his eye. Tucked beneath the velvet lining was a scrap of cloth, torn and stained. He pulled it out and examined it. It was from a fine wool coat, British in style, and embroidered with an initial, R.A. Sally's eyes widened. Reginald Ainsley. DeLuca's face hardened. "I think it's time we paid the good diplomat another visit." They returned to the heart of Rome under cover of night. As the bells of the Basilica di San Giovanni tolled 9, they reached Hotel Regina, where Sir Reginald Ainsley had been staying. The concierge recognized the inspector immediately and led them up to the 3rd floor. DeLuca knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. The concierge then produced a spare key. They opened the door slowly. The room was dark, the air heavy with the scent of cigar smoke. Papers were strewn across the writing desk, and an open valise sat on the floor, half-packed. But Sir Reginald was gone. "What do you bet he's fleeing?" Tony said grimly. DeLuca scanned the room. "Check the papers." Sally moved to the desk and picked up an envelope. Inside was a partially written letter. "The Roman artifact market is far more accessible than anticipated. Mrs. W. has the first of the collection. I shall recover the rest soon. There are complications. Must act quickly before she decides to report me." Signed, R.A. Sally's hand trembled slightly. So he was working with her, then turned against her. Julian sat heavily on the armchair. "I think he killed her to take the treasure for himself." Tony picked up the letter and looked at DeLuca. "So what now?" "We find Sir Reginald," the inspector said flatly, "before he disappears, or silences someone else." As they turned to leave, the telephone in the room rang, shrill and sudden. They froze. DeLuca picked it up. "Pronto!" A distorted voice crackled on the other end, speaking in English. You shouldn't have gone to the church. That was a mistake. DeLuca's hand tightened on the receiver. Who is this? Tell the English boy and girl to stop asking questions, or they'll end up like Whitmore. Click. The line went dead. Tony stared at the receiver. They're watching us. Sally swallowed hard. This isn't just about a treasure. Someone's desperate enough to kill again. DeLuca turned to them. You will remain at your hotel. Lock the doors. Do not speak to anyone. I will send an officer to guard your room. Julian's face was pale. Do you think Sir Reginald made that call? Tony looked out the window, down to the street below. I think we're closer to the truth than ever, he said, and whoever's behind this knows it. As the night deepened over Rome and the stars blinked down on its ancient streets, the friends realized the danger they faced was no longer historical or hypothetical. It was real, it was present, and it was watching them. Chapter 6. The trap is set. A sharp knock startled Tony Middleton out of a fitful sleep. The room at Villa Luciana was cloaked in darkness, save for the dim orange glow from the gas lamp on the wall. He sat upright, heart thudding. Another knock, 3 short raps. He threw on his robe and moved cautiously to the door. Sally was already there, a finger to her lips, listening. "It's Inspector DeLuca," came a low voice from outside. Tony unlatched the door. The inspector stepped in swiftly, his coat damp with the mist of early morning and his eyes glinting with urgency. Behind him stood a uniformed officer who took up position outside the door. "We found him," DeLuca said quietly. "Sir Reginald?" Sally asked, rising from the armchair. The inspector nodded. "He is at the British consulate. Claims he went there to file a report regarding ongoing diplomatic interference. He is trying to play the part of an innocent man, but he knows the net is tightening." Tony crossed his arms. "Are you going to arrest him?" DeLuca shook his head. "Not yet. The British consulate is protected by diplomatic rules. Unless we have irrefutable evidence, we cannot touch him. But I believe he is planning to flee, likely tonight." Sally frowned. "Then we have to act now." DeLuca glanced at her with the smallest trace of admiration. "Indeed, I propose we set a trap, and I need your help." The next morning, the 4 of them, Tony, Sally, Julian, and the inspector, met in a quiet corner of the Borghese Gardens, where birdsong and rustling leaves muffled their voices from prying ears. DeLuca laid out his plan on a folded map of the Roman Forum. "The chest of treasure is now in police custody," he said, "but we will let Sir Reginald believe it is still hidden beneath Santa Lucia della Croce." Tony caught on immediately. "And we'll tell him someone else plans to claim it first." "Precisely," DeLuca said. "Julian will send a message to Sir Reginald anonymously, claiming to know about the treasure's location and threatening to expose everything unless they meet in the crypt tonight. And we'll be waiting." "Armed," Bellucci confirmed, "ready to catch him in the act, stealing from the church ruins, trespassing, attempting to retrieve the treasure, and, if we're lucky, confessing to something more." Julian looked uneasy. "What if he doesn't come alone?" "Then we'll be ready for that too," DeLuca said grimly. "I've requested 2 more plainclothes officers to be stationed near the entrance. We won't let him slip away this time." Sally looked at Tony. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Tony smirked. "Are you kidding? This is exactly the kind of thing I came to Rome for." The hours crawled by. Julian, under DeLuca's instruction, had a note discreetly delivered to the consulate. "The treasure beneath Santa Lucia isn't yours. I know everything. Meet me at the church tonight, 9 o'clock sharp, or I go to the authorities. Come alone." By 8:30, the 4 conspirators were already in position. Inside the crypt of Santa Lucia della Croce, lanterns flickered softly. Sally and Tony crouched behind a broken sarcophagus, while DeLuca and one of his officers stood near the back entrance. The other officer waited above, hidden behind a column. The chest that once held the real treasure had been replaced with a decoy filled with brass coins and fragments. On top lay the scrap of cloth with the initials R.A., now repositioned for maximum impact. Minutes passed. Every creak and gust of wind felt amplified. Then, footsteps. They echoed down the stone steps, slow, deliberate. A figure emerged from the shadows, Sir Reginald Ainsley, clad in a heavy overcoat, a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. Tony tensed. Sally gently placed her hand on his arm. Sir Reginald advanced into the crypt. His eyes darted around. "Who's there?" He moved to the chest and flipped it open. His breath caught. "No." He reached inside, sifting through the contents. When his hand touched the embroidered cloth, he froze. Then a voice rang out. "You were expecting gold, Sir Reginald." DeLuca stepped forward from the shadows, lantern raised. Sir Reginald whirled, gun raised. "Stay back," he barked. The inspector held up a calm hand. "Put the pistol down. You're surrounded." Tony and Sally rose from their hiding place. Two officers stepped into view, pistols drawn. Sir Reginald's mouth twitched. He turned his pistol toward the chest for a split second, then slowly lowered it to the floor. "Well," he said dryly, "I suppose the game's up." Inside police headquarters an hour later, Sir Reginald sat stiffly in a chair, glowering. "I will speak only with the British ambassador," he said haughtily. DeLuca ignored him and turned to the others. "We found the coat that matches the cloth, hidden in his valise. It was torn, likely during the struggle with Mrs. Whitmore." Tony asked, "What happened that day at the Forum?" Sir Reginald snorted. "She grew careless, greedy. She wanted to sell the coin to a French collector. I told her that treasure belonged in British hands, my hands." Sally's eyes narrowed. "So you arranged to meet her at the Temple of Vesta?" "She thought I was going to help her smuggle the rest of it out," Sir Reginald said coldly. "But when she refused to hand it over, we struggled. She fell." "And the coin?" DeLuca asked. "I took it," he admitted, "but I didn't know she had another copy hidden in her glove." Julian stood, stunned. "You killed her? For coins?" "For preservation," Sir Reginald snapped. "The treasures of Rome don't belong to criminals and collectors. They belong to history, and history belongs to those who protect it." Sally stared at him in disbelief. "You murdered her in the name of history?" Sir Reginald smiled grimly. "History is written by the victors." By the following morning, news had spread quietly. The British ambassador agreed to waive immunity in light of Sir Reginald's confession and damning evidence. He would be extradited and face trial in London. Tony and Sally stood once again at the edge of the Roman Forum, looking out at the ruins bathed in early morning light. "It feels different now," Sally said softly. "He turned this place of history into a crime scene." Tony nodded. But justice was served, and Mrs. Whitmore, whatever her faults, deserved better than to be silenced. Julian joined them, lighter in spirit. "I've decided to stay a few more days. There's a museum in Trastevere that's holding a special exhibition on Roman trade routes." Tony grinned. "You're still a historian at heart." DeLuca approached, tipping his hat. "The city owes you both a debt. I suspect Rome will remember you fondly." Tony gave a modest shrug. "We just came here for a holiday." Sally smiled. "And ended up solving a murder." They laughed. The tension at last lifted. As they walked back into the city, the ruins behind them stood silent once more, guardians of secrets and shadows. Chapter 7. The Final Revelation. The day after Sir Reginald Ainsley's arrest dawned clear and golden, the skies over Rome a serene canvas of soft blue. Tony Middleton and Sally Cartwright sat at a small outdoor cafe near the Piazza Navona, enjoying their final breakfast in the Eternal City. The past few days had left them weary but strangely exhilarated. Around them, the city buzzed on, market stalls clinked, bells chimed in the distance, and a violinist played a gentle tune under the morning sun. Sally stirred her coffee thoughtfully. Do you ever think about how odd it is that people walk past ancient temples and churches every day, never knowing what stories lie buried beneath? Tony said. I'm more surprised by how often we end up finding the ones with dead bodies attached. A soft cough interrupted them. Inspector DeLuca, impeccably dressed in a grey morning coat, approached their table. I thought I might catch you before you left, he said with a small smile. We have a few hours, Sally said warmly. Join us? The inspector nodded and sat down. I wanted to thank you both. Without your observations and your persistence, I doubt we would have unravelled the truth in time. Tony shrugged modestly. We've got a nose for trouble, Inspector. Or rather, it seems to have a nose for us. The inspector reached into his coat and placed a small leather-bound notebook on the table. This was recovered from Mrs. Whitmore's effects, he said. I thought you might want to see it. Sally opened the book carefully. Inside, written in elegant looping script, were notes in English, names of locations, sketches of ancient artifacts, references to Roman myths and rituals. She wasn't just stealing for profit, Sally murmured. She was studying them, obsessively. DeLuca nodded. It seemed she believed the treasures she uncovered were part of an ancient priesthood's offerings, items hidden away for safekeeping during the decline of the empire. Tony leaned closer. So the treasure was more than gold. It was symbolic, sacred. Yes, DeLuca said. To her it was history's lost voice. Unfortunately, her ambitions led her into dangerous company. Sally closed the notebook gently. What will happen to the items? They will be returned to the Italian state. Some will be housed in the Capitoline Museum. Others may go to the Vatican archives. And Sir Reginald? Tony asked. DeLuca's expression hardened slightly. He will stand trial in England for theft, conspiracy, and the manslaughter of Beatrice Whitmore. I suspect he'll never see another diplomatic post again. Tony raised his cup. To justice? They clinked their cups in a quiet toast.